Hi friends, I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of social division. In this season of the podcast, we're talking about my book, White Picket Fences, and today's episode takes a look at the themes of Chapter 9. It's called Looking Up. I'm talking with my guest, Todd Billings. I'm going to let Todd introduce himself to you in just a minute, but for those of you who haven't read White Picket Fences, which I'm going to say, I'm really excited to announce, came out 2 years ago on October 2nd, 2018. For those of you who haven't read it or who haven't read it in a while, Chapter 9 is about how our experiences of hardship can connect us to our own humanity and to the humanity of others. And in this interview, Todd actually makes that a little more complicated for me in a good way, because he talks about how our experiences of suffering and hardship on a daily level can lead us to compassion and connection. But he also talks about how a number of studies have shown that traumatic and violent experiences of death and of suffering can also lead to the opposite, can lead to withdrawing into our safe and homogenous tribes. I point this out. There are lots of things we talk about in this interview, but I point this out right now because in American life, in American politics, right now, I think we're in danger of withdrawing into our homogenous tribes. But I also think we have an opportunity to take the risk to love people outside of those tribes. So I'm hopeful that this podcast and that our conversation today points us in the direction of love. My guest today is Todd Billings. Todd is a professor of theology at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, and he's also the author of a newly released book, which I highly recommend. It's called The End of the Christian Life: How Embracing Our Mortality Frees Us to Truly Live. Todd, I'm really glad you're here. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to have a conversation with you, AJ.
Well, so as this title of your book suggests, The End of the Christian Life, our topic today might seem grim to some people. So it would be honest to say that we're here today to talk about mortality and death and dying, and your book covers all of those topics. But I've read your book, and I would say that we are also here to talk about life and about human flourishing and about hope. And I'd like to cover all of those topics and actually talk about how they relate to each other and how they're, in fact, I think you're arguing, integrally connected to one another. And I also want to relate all of this to the themes of this podcast when it comes to social divisions and what it means to participate in some of the healing of our communities and our nation. But before we get to all of that, I would love to give our listeners just a sense of who you are and what your story is. So could you walk us through what you would say your story is in terms of how you came to write this book at this time?
Yeah, thanks, AJ. I think that there's two stories kind of coming together. One of them is I'm a cancer patient. I was diagnosed with an incurable cancer in 2012. Married with 2 young kids in my late 30s. And I became a member of the cancer community, kind of like an anthropologist becomes a participant observer in a culture, except for I became like a real member of that tribe.
Involuntarily also.
Right. But I am really a nerd, and so wherever I go and whatever culture I go into, and I've been immersed in a couple of cultures in East Africa for a few years and things, I'm always observing as well as, reading. And so I discovered that the cancer community was in my current location in Michigan before I really knew about it, and I just hadn't seen it. But here's a community that death plays a really big part. And the reality of death, whether you are 6 years old or 86 years old, is just very real. And so you make friends, you provide each other support, and then in unexpected ways, it doesn't matter if the person is 6 or 86. Sometimes you see the person live for 5 or 10 years, and sometimes the person doesn't make it through 1 year. And so the other aspect of this was, as a seminary professor, I would ask students who had entered into pastoral ministry what some of their biggest challenges were. And again, they talked about death and dying. And so a number of these students were in their late 20s when they started. They had maybe attended, one or two funerals in their life. Suddenly they are advising family members about how to approach the end of life. They are presiding at 10 to 12 funerals each year. It's such a big part of congregational life that because of the way in which our culture is so divided according to age group and ability and so forth, they hadn't been exposed to it.
Right.
And so when I had a number of colloquies with some of my former students as pastors, and once we started to dig under the surface, we found that the problem wasn't just about end of life. It was about the story that people in the church were absorbing. The story of discipleship in the gospel didn't have a meaningful place for death. And so that's really the approach that I take in the end of the Christian life, where whether you are young or old, whether you are a parent or a child with, an aging parent, all of us, our mortality matters for all of us and how we relate and connect to one another. And the Bible has a lot to say that's actually very surprising and life-giving around these things. But because death isn't even on the radar screen for how many of us are discipled in the Christian faith, I think we miss out on this aspect of discipleship.
Yeah, I'd love to actually ask you a little bit more about that, because I think there are two ways that there are two aspects to our culture, right? There's like how our secular culture handles death and mortality, which is different from the past. And then there's also how our Christian culture handles death and mortality that's different from the past. So I'd love for you to if you could just sketch out how that has affected our culture. Like how did we used to handle it, whether that's in secular terms or in Christian terms, and what is the common practice and picture now? You've alluded to it a little bit, but I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, our culture overall has undergone what some social scientists call the great health transition, where the biggest change is actually not in like cancer treatments or specialized treatments, but in public health. And so people are living longer, much longer than 100 years ago. But then connected with this, even into the middle of the 20th century, most deaths took place in the home in America and in most, Western countries. And so most children would have had the experience of being basically a hospice worker or a grandparent or a parent. The death of children was much more common.
Right.
And so it's actually the ordinary everyday experiences of death that we have become isolated from. It may seem really counterintuitive to listeners to think that death is something one of the claims I make in the book is that we live in a death-denying culture and often a death-denying Christian culture. That may seem really counterintuitive to people. It's like, well, death is all over the headlines. And, what great movie plot doesn't have death in it?
Sure.
But in many ways, that just reinforces the point. It's the everyday experience of death that we have isolated ourselves from. And so after I was diagnosed with cancer, for example, I started to see a counselor to help with our kids. And, I'm very likely to die before they graduate from high school. How does that affect my parenting now? And one of the suggestions that the counselor had, which was quite wise, I think, is, use every opportunity you have to expose them to death. So like with the death of a pet, we, rather than just saying, your dog's not here anymore, or I have a lot of friends that had stories like that from childhood. We had a little memorial service when our dog died, and we have them pet our dog on the living room floor and buried the dog in the backyard, and there was a lot of weeping and wailing. But there was also, just for weeks and weeks, many, many questions about death that they got to ask.
Right. I should mention here, my mother-in-law in 2003, so a long time ago, was diagnosed with primary liver cancer. And I ended up with my husband being her primary caregiver. She was only alive for 6 months. And it was, I resonated so much with so many of the experiences you describe in your book, both in terms of this community of people that I didn't know existed, who are all in some ways going about their regular lives, but they're also getting treatment, and their bodies have become much more noticeable to themselves even than ever before. And I was actually, we were with her in her home when she died, which was both a grueling, hard, the most kind of hard physical experience I've ever witnessed and participated in, but also really beautiful and very final in a helpful way, actually. So there was, anyway, I was thinking about all of that as I was reading your book, and also about noticing at that time the cemeteries that are no longer in churchyards. And certainly some of that has to do with space, and urban planning, but some of it has to do with, let's not see those tombstones anymore.
Yeah, we're going to sequester it out. Yeah.
Yeah, and even just hair dye and wrinkle cream, but let's pretend this isn't going to happen to me. And I just really saw that in a way I hadn't before, but I also saw my mother-in-law say, I know I'm going to die. And as a result of that, I have some work to do. I need to figure out where I'm going. I want to understand what the Bible has to say about heaven. I need to deal with the people who I have unfinished business with, right? I need to forgive some people. I need to ask for some forgiveness. So it was this condensed experience of what you described, and certainly different in many ways. But I was aware, as you said, of that death-denying culture. Well, so, all right, I want to ask two more questions on this. So one is, how do you see that? We certainly see that easily, I think, in our secular culture. I just gave those two examples of cemeteries and, hair dye. But what about Christian culture? Where do we see this within the church itself? What have we replaced an understanding of our mortality with?
Yeah. Well, two things immediately come to mind. One is, I think a tremendous gift of the church is that it's one of the few places in our cultural moment where young children and middle-aged people and dying older people can come together and be part of a community.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I was diagnosed with cancer that I would sometimes bring my kids to the seminary, and it's really fun to be there. But I noticed there's nobody dying there. All of us are dying, of course, but all sorts of gatherings of people intentionally or unintentionally exclude those who are dying. And so it's an opportunity for the church, but it's also often a missed opportunity. So one of the things that we did was we went to an elder who works with care ministry in our church and just asked, who are some homebound people who don't have family in the area that we could visit?
Yeah.
And I really wanted my kids to know them and to know some dying people. And so we became really good friends and with a number of those. And then, but it's just odd because when I would, after one of them died, I take my daughter out of school to go to a funeral, and people are kind of like, you're what?
Right.
And we were actually with him in his, we were the last people with him where he was actually speaking a few hours before he died. And so it's an opportunity, but then there's also the fact that on the one hand, many churches are becoming more and more homogeneous units in terms of their generations. So I remember chatting with one of my students who was in a church plant, and he said, I've been pastor there for 5 years and I've never had a single funeral.
Wow.
And so I just asked, well, what age are the people? And, there's nobody over 40. So it's a similar thing where we lose the gifts of the body of Christ when we have just an all-white church. We also lose the gifts of the body of Christ when we have an all young church, or when we don't have dying people in our midst.
Yeah.
And then the other challenge is just that because of how we institutionalize the dying, for some good reasons at times, but
Right.
there are so many in our congregations who can't join the community in worship and on Sunday morning. So it makes it all the harder to receive, not just to minister to them, but to receive benefit from them. I mean, they have so much to offer. They are not just ill people. They are ministers of the gospel. And I could tell story after story of those who we were visiting in nursing homes who were just amazing.
And you tell
ministers.
some of those stories in the book, and it's really beautiful. And I love the relationship that your children have with some of these elderly people. And we actually go to this little country church where there are actually probably more people over the age of 60 than under. And I think that is such a gift to our children, that they really know these older people and are connected to them in a pretty intimate way. But I do think that's a loss that many churches and communities have, sustained in the course of, what did you call it? Some health.
The homogeneous unit principle was it was the big church planting principle for many decades in church circles from.
Because human beings like homogeneity, even if it actually is not God's vision of how we can flourish.
Yeah.
Well, so let's talk about that for a minute, because one of the things that you do bring up in your book, and that obviously is of interest to me, is the thought of having privilege. You write about being, a white, educated Protestant American man, which has, by social situation, isolated you from some degree of experiencing suffering and contemplating mortality. And even in the midst of cancer, you're aware that all of those things are still, quote unquote, helping you in some ways that someone else with the same experience actually doesn't have the same advantages. At the same time, you talk about this experience of Sheol. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Sheol?
Yeah, my wife is an Old Testament scholar, and she pretty much says, yeah, anything like that. I ask her the same question.
Something like that will work.
Yeah,
great.
Yeah.
I would love for you to explain what Sheol is, and also talk about how that, I love the way your chapter on Sheol describes that experience, and how this connects to this daily, the ordinary experience of suffering, of life in the pit, especially for countless people who are experiencing either kind of physical suffering and, knowledge of death impending, or injustice and oppression. I mean, I think there's a continuum of suffering that might be physical in nature, or it might be in some other way happening to us. So I'd love for you to just talk about Sheol a bit.
Yeah. This is one of the things that once I got diving into the book and some of the biblical literature about resurrection hope, I found that it was just different than what I was expecting. Sheol is a Hebrew word that's used sometimes in the Old Testament just to talk in a generic way about the place where the dead go. And this is how it was used by surrounding cultures to the Hebrew people. So it would have been a well-known, concept, sort of the underworld. But even in various parts of the Old Testament, you also have a different sense of Sheol used, where there are biologically living people in Sheol. I mean, the image for Sheol is literally a pit. Sometimes it's translated the miry pit, a muddy pit. And so when the psalmist cries out from Sheol and says, I am in Sheol, that's a place where they are saying, where the concept of Sheol is not just biological life or death, but it's actually correlated with the temple as the dwelling place of God as an opposite. So, Psalm 27, you are crying out from the pit, and the psalmist wants to dwell in the house of God, the temple of God. In Jonah, which is one of my favorite examples of this, Jonah talks about the belly of the fish as Sheol, and then he cries out, not just to be delivered from the belly of the fish, but to go to the temple. Obviously, the psalmist is still alive when they're saying this. Jonah is still alive when they're saying this. But I think the underlying point is that for the Old Testament imagination, there's something more important than even biological life and death.
Right.
What's even more fundamental is God, and the presence of God is life.
Right.
And alienation from God is
death.
And so I think there's all sorts of ways in which we live and can live in Sheol, in this place of alienation from God, while we are living. And when I use that term, alienation from God, I'm not just talking about non-Christians. I'm talking about living in places where we really sense, like Jesus did on the cross,
Right.
my God, why have you forsaken me? Where it feels like this God-forsaken place.
Right.
And I found that certainly as a cancer patient, I was brought into this place and learned to lament in new ways, and the gift of biblical lament. But I also found that there were others there lamenting who were there for different reasons. I remember one of my students who I had read this manuscript and that chapter on Sheol. He said, Sheol was my neighborhood growing up in a rough urban city in California. I was shot many times, had many of his friends die from gang violence before he was 20.
Wow.
Like, I know this place.
Yeah.
And so there's two just amazing, wonderful things about how Scripture speaks into this. One of them is that even though there's this very dark, shadowed portrait of Sheol, there's a sense in which this place, which seems like the very absence of God, is also in a mysterious way where God is present. I mean, there's moments of that in the Psalms. Even in the depths of Sheol, I'm there. And then I think we see this most clearly in the lament of Jesus on the cross, that he pioneers Sheol so that we're not alone there. Yet we still need deliverance, and we cry out for deliverance there, but we're not alone in Sheol. Now, when I unpack some of these themes, it's interesting how people hear them. I remember, AJ, after I wrote a book about lament, shortly after I was diagnosed with cancer, someone coming up to me and saying, Todd, this is such a valuable book. This must be why God gave you cancer. And so it's a deeply biblical theme to say that God's power is manifest through weakness, and that God can be present in Christ even in these dark places.
Yeah.
But that's not a very good way to frame it, in the sense of, can God be present to my student growing up in gang territory in this city in California? Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
But what God is doing is being his presence in Christ is to be the God of life there. And so it's a little bit like when I was in Uganda doing community development work. I found that the original missionaries there had been in this remote area, had spread the gospel, and the people were really grateful, but they had really centered in on the idea of blessed are the poor. And the thing is that it was basically blessed are the poor, which, the missionaries were not poor, but the people were told they were poor. So you're blessed in this situation. But this is where there was about 50% infant mortality. And, by the time I arrived, they were saying, that was almost like a kind of curse. So you have to be really careful in how you hold this together. Is God on the side of the poor and the oppressed in a special way? Absolutely. But it's also not helpful to set it up in certain angles in terms of providence.
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring all of this up, and you're pushing my mind in lots of different directions, because I actually have an essay coming out soon about the difference between the idea that God is love and God is in control. And not to say that God's not sovereign, or that God doesn't work all things for good, or that there's not a true providential hand in all that happens. And yet at the same time, to submit ourselves to the workings of love that is uncontrolling and that does allow injustice and oppression, even while saying, I'm on the side of the ones who are being oppressed and who are in that pit. I'm with them in that pit, even as I'm also rescuing them from it. I mean, it's
The
very
deliverer as well.
complicated. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think a lot about that. And I think a lot about that, especially from my position as a person of privilege, because there are lots of things that I can look at in my life and see as like being provided by God or answers to prayer. And I think sometimes there's some like proper humility in that, because I'm being grateful and I'm recognizing that I have not earned my kind of place in life. But at the same time, I could easily tell the same story and say, no, that has to do with the fact that your parents were white and married and educated. Like, it has nothing to do with God. And it's hard to actually kind of untangle those threads. And maybe I'm not supposed to be able to. But I do, at the same time, one of the ways that I found that cut through some of those questions of like, is it privilege, is it providence, is the experience of mortality, that like facing the human limitations that you talk about, both through the death of my mother-in-law and also through our daughter's disability, and recognizing, again, this is an area in which I do not have control, but I am invited to love. If I see cancer as a problem, if I see Down syndrome as a problem, it's certainly not one I'm fixing, right? And I've been thinking about this recently because of the pandemic, and there have been all these people who've said, oh, COVID-19 can strike anyone down. It's not a disease that cares about our social divisions. And it's like, but at the same time, as a person who does not need to go to a building where I work alongside other people, I have protections, right? Like, as a person with enough wealth to be able to be at home, I have protections. This is all a very long lead up to saying, how do you, when we are looking at questions of suffering and mortality, I'm curious how you see both social divisions continuing to divide us, but also whether there are ways in which understanding our mortality actually connects us as human beings.
Yeah, that's a powerful question. What it makes me think about is the work of a group of social psychologists, actually, who I got to know in this process. They have an approach called terror management theory, where they examine what are the effects of exposure to death and dying in a visceral way upon people's behavior. And it's really, a lot of it comes out of the research of this book that I love, published in the year that I was born, Ernst Becker, The Denial of Death, who was this fascinating agnostic Jewish scholar who was trying to come to terms with the Holocaust, who had Martin Luther King Jr. and Dietrich Bonhoeffer as his heroes, and couldn't read enough Soren Kierkegaard. I mean, what a puzzle that man was. I mean, how do you put all that together? But there's a sense in which there is something about our mortality per se that is democratizing, or could be, that we are all mortal creatures, no matter how much we try to, deny that, control that. But some of how this actually functions and works is that, particularly when we're in a culture that has some distance from the everyday experience of mortality, when we get vivid experiences of it, like someone close to us dies, or it could even be a vivid experience of, something really horrific like the George Floyd video, or, a death like that. What these studies, and there have been over 100 of these studies done show is that as human beings, we tend to perceive a threat and go with our tribe. So we tend to, the sociologists talk about it as a sort of a tightening of the worldview. So whoever is from my nation or my ethnic group or, perhaps my religion, those are the only ones who can be trusted. Outsiders are threats. And so it's just this kind of instinctive response. And so you can see
an instinctive
Yeah.
response specifically to seeing death.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, a close exposure to violence. But what's really interesting is that when they've done studies about people who have more everyday experiences with death, or people like chaplains or funeral directors or that sort of thing, it can actually, like ongoing exposure actually can lead to the opposite effect. It actually can open you up in compassion.
Yeah.
And there have been, I don't think enough studies, but there have been some studies that even prayer, like meditative forms of prayer, I think is particularly what has been studied, can also have this capacity to be both. It's not like you're accepting of death in the sense that death is no longer an enemy, but it allows you to move out in compassion toward others. And so I find it helpful just to even be aware of that. I mean, as I've observed in the pandemic, how much we actually expose ourselves to the reality of what is taking place in terms of the dying has dramatically changed, in various parts of the times of the pandemic. So, early on, there was a lot of news coverage and exposure. And then there's other political things that come up. And then, the whole pandemic becomes politicized about whether to wear masks or not. And I think whenever life and death issues matter, and so they do have political consequences, but death is also a mystery that we're never going to get our minds and hearts completely around. So I do get nervous when deaths are sort of simply politicized in a flat sense.
Well, no, I think it's really interesting because essentially what you're saying is there are some aspects of like violent or traumatic suffering and death that only make us want to kind of close in on ourselves.
Yeah.
Then there's other more of this just like ordinary human experience that can really connect us to one another. So there's a both and, which I think comes up so much in your book, that death in a Christian perspective is both a foe to be conquered and overcome and a friend to be welcomed and understood. And I think there are many of those tensions there. I also, for me, I've been thinking about, I actually did a Zoom video call with an English teacher who was not a Christian and said, one of the ways I related to your book was in this experience of mortality and recognizing that what I understand that makes us human is that we're all going to die. And he referenced Homer and he referenced Shakespeare and just this sense of like, we all have the same amount of land we're going to take up when our bones go into the grave. And I was like, yes, that is true. But I also think we're connected in our capacity to give and receive love. Like, it's not just about our mortality in terms of being connected as humans, but for me, recognizing that common human limitations, common experience of neediness and vulnerability, even though I have not personally faced my imminent death or have not faced personal experience with disability in my own body, because of the people around me who I've loved, what that's done is it's actually opened me up to love. I do think that's what I'm hearing from you in terms of the experience of chaplains. That's what I'm reading in your own book and in choosing to bring your kids to the nursing home and kind of embrace the fullness of what it means to be human. Death is a limit and we can't go beyond it, at least in our minds on our own. But at the same time, it's a limit that relates to other limits that we have in our bodies. I mean, you even write about sleep as this kind of mini death where we just surrender our bodies to something and we're not even quite sure what it is. I mean, there are things that are happening physically while we're asleep, but it's a fascinating thing that we do every single day. And there's
kind of
a sense
mini
in which,
death.
It's a mini death that relates. And how much do we fight against that sleep. And yet when we get it, there's a sense of acknowledging our creatureliness that can be life-giving. Well, I have one final question. There was this place in the book where you're writing about a passage from Hebrews, and you wrote, Hebrews does not say that Christians should no longer fear death because of Christ. No. Our deliverance is from slavery to death's fear. Stated differently, the goal of the Christian life is not eliminating the fear of death, but removing death from its throne. I love that. I think that's so helpful. But I would love to just ask you to speak about what possibilities open up when we are free from slavery to the fear of death. And how might we do that? How has that played out in your life? I mean, you can take it wherever you want, but just I'm thinking about that difference between being enslaved to fear and being aware and fearful, but not letting death be on the throne.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the reason I even framed it that way is that I do, in Christian circles, sometimes get the idea that, well, we shouldn't be afraid of death at all. And I don't think that's actually either biblical teaching or likely to happen, really, honestly, for any of us. And so it sets up this ideal that makes people shameful when they grieve deeply. And, I remember a person in my church just heaving with tears. It was the anniversary. It would have been his 56th anniversary, and his wife had died the year before. And he said, I know I shouldn't be crying because everybody tells me she's in a better place.
Right.
But I just want her here, And so there is, of course, we should have a certain fear of death. But when fear of death is on the throne, then self-protection becomes the central priority. It's kind of like, as I noted with those studies, when we're exposed to, death, oh, this could happen to you, you pull in rather than reach out in compassion. And so I think some of what it looks like is being willing to take risks, knowing that they are risks, and to be both aware of, even if it's not a life-threatening act, aware that this could damage my reputation, this could damage my, earthly fortunes, but this is what the love of God and neighbor is calling me to. It's there's a kind of slavery to self-protection that we can easily slip into, and particularly when we have in a middle class culture with cell phones and our schedules up to us, and it can just make us feel like we're master of the universe, when we're just not. But as long as we're under that illusion, we don't really get out of a self-protection zone. And so I think when we are willing to just honestly say, I'm dying, I'm not going to live forever, and 50, 100 years from now, nobody's going to remember who I am, most likely. At most, they might know my name. There's actually something very freeing about that.
When you talk about it freeing us to do small things because we're small people, but not to see them as insignificant, but just to do the small act of love that is a risk because it's connecting you to someone else. It's extending yourself. It's on some even minimal level, sacrificing, whether it's time or money or energy or whatever it might be. But yeah, I also wrote down another quote. In light of genuine Christian hope, a daily embrace of our mortality can refresh our parched souls, freeing us to generously love rather than cling to methods of self-preservation. And I so want that, right? To instead of clinging and insulating and isolating, to open my life, my hands, my heart, but recognizing that makes me vulnerable. And so that means I'm open to love. And it also means I'm open, I think, to more pain. And that is exactly what Jesus did for us, right? Was to say, in opening myself to humanity and to the love that I have for you all, I'm also exposing myself to the pain that comes with that. And yet we're invited to go right there with him and experience both that suffering and dying and rising.
And in a sense, I think the Apostle Paul sees that his pioneering of that as a source of hope, because
Right.
in union with him, even our mortal body is wasting away. 2 Corinthians 4 has become a really important passage just for me spiritually in the writing this, where we carry death in our bodies, but we're not doing anything heroic in a sense. We're just it's our union with Christ who has gone before us that we're called to live into. And so it's this strange paradox, because it's when we live into that union and the self-giving love within that, which is the opposite of clinging to this life now, or even just like, I'm going to change the world forever myself and I'm the hero. When we live into that union with Christ, that's often when our lives actually have the most significance as well.
Yeah. And I think the hope that we have both in not having to depend upon ourselves to fix it all, save it all, and, live forever, but also in connecting to the work that God is doing, both to bring the temple, to bring heaven to our experience here and now, but also this greater promise of one day living in the fullness of the presence of God. When that becomes our animating hope, there's both this sense of like pulling the future into the present moment, but also longing for that future, which is where, death becomes a passage. And again, not in some Pollyanna, it's all, for the good way, but there is some reality. There's certainly a lot of hope on the other side of that.
Yeah. One thing I've just real briefly that I've noticed already from readers is that the older readers that I've had, the readers who I've had who have in their 80s, their favorite chapters are the last few chapters that are, talking about this very bodily expectation of the world to come. And younger readers actually tend to be more attracted to and want to process more some of the earlier chapters. But I really do think that we shouldn't be shy about just having an astonishing hope for the age to come. And I think that makes our witness very powerful right now when embraced in the right sort of way. It's not just, I have a ticket to heaven and I'm just going to live my own life.
Yes.
But it's, this same heaven, the same presence of God that we've been aching for from the pit and in our whole pilgrimage. This one centered in Jesus is, that will be the wide and spacious land, so to speak, of our rejoicing and dwelling and rest.
I think that is a good place to call this conversation to a close. Thank you for that. I love the idea of an astonishing hope for the world to come. And I am really grateful for the work that you've done to bring all of these thoughts and to weave together really good theological study and reflection, along with these very personal experiences of your own life, as well as the lives of these other people who you've gotten to know. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much, AJ. It's great to chat with you.
Thanks so much for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. Again, Todd is the author of The End of the Christian Life, recently published by Brazos. It's a great book. We will link to it in the show notes. And as always, do you get tired of hearing me say this? Does anyone even listen to the outro of this podcast? Because if I'm honest, I skip the outros when I listen to podcasts regularly. But anyway, if you are listening, I will say again that I would love for you to share this episode, to subscribe to this podcast so you'll get next week's awesome conversation, and of course, to give it a rating or a review wherever you find your podcast so that even more people can benefit from knowing about this host of great people who have wonderful things to say. I also want to thank our co-host, Breaking Ground, which has a wonderful podcast of its own, as well as articles and videos that reflect from a Christian perspective on how to think about the past, understand the present, and explore redemptive possibilities for the future. You can find more about that at breakingground.us. I'm also very thankful to Jake Hansen for editing this podcast, to Amber Beery, my social media coordinator, and to all of you who listen. I always end this way, but I'm going to say it again because I so want this to be true for me and for you. As you go into your day today, I hope and pray that you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.